homophobia is whether a country criminalizes homosexual identity. So that's what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. Firstly, criminalization of acts that are variously described as buggery, carnal knowledge against the order of nature, gross indecency, and things of that sort. It occurs in about 80 jurisdictions around the world. Those are mostly national jurisdictions, but occasionally at the subnational level as well. So how does the Commonwealth figure in this? As you know, there are 54 Commonwealth countries spread across all regions of the world, and that represents about 25%, just over 25% of all the countries in the world. But the Commonwealth represents over 50% of the countries that criminalize homosexuality. That's 42 of the 54 Commonwealth countries, which is 80%, almost 80% of all Commonwealth countries criminalize homosexuality in one form or another. The severity of the prescribed punishments in the criminal codes of these countries varies. So just to give a few examples, in Malawi, the prison term is up to 14 years with or without corporal punishment. In Trinidad and Tobago, up to 25 years in jail. In Jamaica, up to 10 years in prison with hard labor. In Malaysia, up to 20 years in prison and flogging. In Singapore, imprisonment of up to 2 years. In Tonga, up to 10 years with or without whipping. And there's life imprisonment, or up to life imprisonment, in several Commonwealth countries, in various regions of the world. So Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Guyana, and Barbados all have up to life imprisonment. One of those countries, Uganda, is seeking to actually expand the criminal sanction relating to homosexuality. So even though it already has a punishment of up to life imprisonment, there is an anti-homosexuality bill currently before Parliament, which is proposing to penalize parents, doctors, teachers, people in a position of authority who refuse or fail to report a known gay person or lesbian to the authorities within 24 hours. That can get you up to 3 years in prison. It also seeks to criminalize with up to 7 years anyone who promotes or funds LGBT human rights activism. So the showing of this film, if it happened in Uganda, it could get you 7 years.
Ouch.
And it also permits mob justice with impunity to anyone who feels that they're a victim of homosexuality. So it has a provision that says that anyone who is a victim shall not be guilty of any crime arising as a result of having been such a victim. So essentially it allows murder, maiming of people with impunity. So where did these laws originate? They originate from this country's 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, which punished sodomy with 10 years to life imprisonment. And that was actually abolishing the previous punishment of the death penalty, which had been around since as early as 1533. But it was at the 1861 version of that act which was in place at the time of British colonialism. So in the 19th century, when Britain was busy colonizing the world, it spread that law along with it. And the offences of buggery and gross indecency and the like were spread around all the British colonies. Those laws, of course, were repealed in this country in 1967, but that was just after most of the colonies obtained their independence, so the repeal in this country had no impact in what were then the former British colonies. In contrast, other colonizing nations had much earlier removed similar criminal provisions from their statute books. So Napoleon's French Penal Code of 1810 and various codes that derived from that around Europe no longer had sodomy as a provision. So when they were colonizing, they weren't spreading such laws. So what cost does this have, maintaining this British colonial legacy around the Commonwealth? There's a wide variance in the extent to which there is active prosecution under these laws, and of course also the impacts that they have on the LGBT communities in these countries. So this film portrays the personal story, the kind of stigma and isolation that people face when they live in countries that have these sorts of laws. in many countries, people are actually subject to the risk of incarceration. So countries like Cameroon is actively prosecuting people under similar provision as exists in Jamaica. You may have heard a story about a male student, university student, who sent a text message to another man saying, "I'm really in love with you," and he's now under a conviction and a sentence of 3 years imprisonment for that. 2 women are also awaiting trial in Cameroon for engaging in sexual intimacy. In Grenada, a recent spate of arrests was carried out, at least 2 of which have resulted in prosecutions. And Gambia was in the spotlight in 2011 when its Western Region Minister ordered the immediate arrest of all homosexuals in the region. Even in those countries that don't actively prosecute or haven't for many years actively prosecuted under these laws, the laws are used to, by police and others, to harass LGBT people. So just one of many examples. In Singapore, a man who reported a theft to the police, a theft by a male partner, was warned by police under the penal code provision. Rather than investigating the theft, they warned him under the provision against homosexuality. Laws are also used to prohibit LGBT people from associating and assembling. So in Uganda, in early last year, a workshop for LGBT people that was on human rights and advocacy and leadership was shut down by the Minister of Ethics and Integrity. In Cameroon, similarly, armed police broke up a planned 3-day meeting on HIV and sexual minorities. And of course, in all countries that have criminal laws against homosexuality, even when there's little or no active prosecution, the mere fact of criminalization provides a license to discriminate in employment, housing, social benefits, a full range of things. Really disconcertingly, the ability to prevent the spread of HIV is seriously and directly compromised by criminalization. In 2012, there was a global commission on HIV and the law, which did extensive research and concluded that criminalization both causes and boosts the rate of HIV among men who have sex with men. As some examples of how that plays out in Caribbean countries where homosexuality is criminalized, and that's most of the Commonwealth Caribbean and none of the non-Commonwealth Caribbean, almost 1 in 4 men who have sex with men are infected with HIV. And in the absence of such laws, so in countries that don't criminalize, the prevalence rate is only 1 in 15. Similarly, the odds of HIV infection in black men who have sex with men relative to the general populations was found to be nearly 2 times higher in African countries that criminalize homosexuality than for those living in countries that don't have such laws. So an example of why that's so, again, in another Commonwealth country, in Kenya, where carnal knowledge against the order of nature is criminalized, the Medical Research Institute had its HIV work disrupted after church leaders claimed that it was providing counseling service to criminals. So, of course, people don't have access to the HIV information that they need, the safe sex information that they need, the treatment, the testing, and everything else. So it's not surprising that HIV rates, of course, are much higher in these countries. And it's also not surprising that the Commonwealth is particularly implicated in the global HIV and AIDS crisis. Just to put it in perspective again, while the Commonwealth, in terms of population, accounts for 30% of the population globally, it accounts for 60% of people living with HIV. Of course, even in countries that have decriminalized recently, discrimination and sometimes violent discrimination continues. So legalization is not an immediate panacea. It's not doesn't cure or change everything, at least immediately. So South Africa is a good example. South Africa is one of the only constitutions in the world that expressly prohibits discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation. And the country has a very progressive constitutional court which decriminalized homosexuality in 1998. But homophobia is rampant and often very violent in South Africa. For example, there are reports that at least 500 lesbians become victims of so-called corrective rape every year. So, what do we do about it? I'm only going to be talking about the law, and that, of course, is only one part of a much bigger picture. But certainly changes in the law are required because these laws are perpetuating this type of discrimination and putting people at risk on a whole bunch of fronts, as I just talked about. But clearly, that's not the only thing. Attitudes and awareness have to change, which is why films like this are so important. Education has to change. Religious institutions, importantly, have to change their mindset. They're often the main supporters of continued criminalization. And when cases are brought in the courts, they're often, they get themselves named as parties to oppose decriminalization. That notwithstanding, there are examples in the religious world where leaders have spoken out, and we need more of those. Archbishop Desmond Tutu is perhaps one of the best examples. And he likens the persecution of the LGBT community, including through criminalization, as nearly the ultimate blasphemy. So in terms of changing laws, the ideal, of course, is legislative reform, where parliaments voluntarily repeal these archaic laws that weren't really theirs in the first place. But where that doesn't work or is taking too long, communities often decide to use the courts and the judicial branch of government to try and get these laws struck down. And the courts around the world are being used using constitutional law, the national constitution, and also international human rights law. So the types of legally binding human rights obligations that most Commonwealth countries are bound by, either in their own constitution or through an international treaty or both, include the right to equality and non-discrimination, the right to privacy, the right to dignity, the right to not suffer inhuman and degrading treatment and punishment, those types of provisions. But other rights that end up being implicated are things like the right to life, the right to health, talked about HIV, the right to freedom of speech and association, giving the examples of Uganda and Cameroon. So a huge range of human rights, legally binding human rights, are implicated in criminalization. Litigation, as a last resort, because it's a long process, it's a complicated, timely, costly process that can also bring a lot of pain and suffering to the people involved, because it is not easy, and often if you're in a country where there's severe homophobia, it's a difficult process to go through. But there are people that are using the courts to have these laws struck down. And these are at the domestic level, the regional level, and the international level. So at the domestic level, there have been successful constitutional challenges just in the last 10 to 15 years in jurisdictions as diverse as South Africa, India, Fiji, Nepal, Peru, the United States, and Hong Kong. And there's ongoing litigation right now in Belize, Grenada, and Singapore, with others in the planning stages and more likely to follow. In addition to those domestic cases, there are regional and international bodies that monitor international human rights treaty obligations, and those bodies have been used similarly to challenge these laws. So at the international level, there's an international treaty called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which contains rights to privacy, rights to equality, a right to life, freedom of association. That treaty was used in a case against Australia in 1994 when one subnational jurisdiction criminalized. It was only Tasmania that continued to criminalize, the rest of the other states of Australia having decriminalized through the legislative process. So a case was brought before the Human Rights Committee in Geneva, which found that criminalization is a breach of that international treaty, which many other Commonwealth countries have signed up to. Similarly, at the regional level, the European Court of Human Rights, there have been cases against Northern Ireland, Ireland, and Cyprus, all of which found criminal provisions to be against the European Convention on Human Rights, and as a result, those laws were struck out. So as a result of both legislative processes and litigation, there's now only one jurisdiction in Europe that criminalizes, and that's Northern Cyprus. There is a case currently before the European Court of Human Rights, which we're involved with, which will get rid of that provision as well. So Europe at least will have no remaining jurisdictions that criminalize. And coming back full circle to Jamaica, there's a regional body called the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that monitors the American Convention on Human Rights, and Jamaica is a party to that. So there is a case against Jamaica at the Inter-American Commission. As you've seen from the film, there is rampant violence and discrimination in Jamaica, murders, police brutality, death threats, and most importantly, the refusal or inability of the police to investigate crimes against gays and lesbians are all a feature unfortunately, of life in Jamaica. So we're involved in a case for a very inspiring man named Gareth Henry, who was a leading LGBT activist in Jamaica, and he ended up being forced to leave Jamaica as a result of persecution. He suffered death threats, he suffered police brutality, and eventually he had to flee to Canada, which granted him asylum. And also after that, because of threats to his family, who refused to disown him. They were asked to disown him and they refused. They had to flee because of threats to their own lives. So his mother, his sister, and his nieces and nephews all had to claim asylum in Canada. So there is a case going ahead. The local LGBTI community decided that it had to use the courts. The political process simply is not going to work in Jamaica, and they decided to use the courts. So there is a challenge against the buggery and gross indecency laws, and also a challenge to a constitutional amendment that tried to put outside the jurisdiction of the courts any challenge to those laws. The Constitution now actually says, as of 2011, actually says there shall be no challenge to the sexual offences laws, which include the buggery and gross indecency laws. So the courts have sort of been, under the Constitution at least, pushed aside. So that's why this case is at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So hopefully in the coming months, or hopefully not too many years, that case will go ahead. So in conclusion, the Commonwealth is both significantly implicated in the reality of homophobia in the world and key to its eventual eradication. And I think it's thanks to films like Taboo Yardies that help create awareness amongst people, and thanks to legislators who have taken it upon themselves to repeal these archaic laws, and to brave individuals like Gareth Henry that seek redress in the courts, often at great personal sacrifice, that hopefully in our lifetime we will see that figure of 80% of the Commonwealth criminalizing significantly go down. Thank you.